Lorraine, France. September 1944. The air hangs thick with gunpowder and damp earth. A narrow French road winds between shattered hedgerows, littered with burned-out tanks, blackened husks marking yesterday's fight. A German Panther crouches in the fog, its gun barrel glistening with dew, engine idling low. Inside the turret, the commander peers through Zeiss optics, spotting movement through the mist. Another Sherman, the same weak American tank they've torn apart all summer. He smirks. The crew readies the gun. They've done this 100 times. One round, one kill. But before the Panther fires, a brilliant flash cuts across the valley, faster than they can react. A tungsten-cored HVAP shell, traveling at unimaginable speed, punches through the Panther's frontal armor like it's paper. The roar echoes across the fields. The German crew sits stunned in the seconds before the flames erupt. Disbelief replacing confidence, pride turning to panic. In that moment, the myth of German invincibility dies, and a new era of armored warfare begins. One forged not in design brilliance, but in adaptation, innovation, and the quiet persistence of men once mocked for driving inferior machines. The Americans had found their answer, hidden inside a shell of tungsten and resolve. By the spring of 1944, tank warfare had become a contest not just of armor and firepower, but of philosophy. Germany believed in the supremacy of engineering. The Reich's factories built tanks like the Panther and Tiger with precision and pride, each a monument to industrial craftsmanship and battlefield dominance. The United States, by contrast, believed in logistics. Its planners favored numbers, speed, and simplicity. Machines that could be built fast, repaired easily, and shipped across oceans by the thousands. At the center of that philosophy stood one machine, the M4 Sherman. When the Sherman first entered combat in North Africa in 1942, it seemed adequate. It was fast, reliable, and its 75mm gun could destroy most Axis armor at medium range. But as the war evolved, so did its opponents. By 1943, the German Panther had arrived, a predator born from the lessons of the Eastern Front. With its sloped 80mm frontal armor and a high-velocity 75mm Koibu K-42 gun, it could pierce a Sherman long before the American crew even saw it. The imbalance was brutal. During the Normandy campaign in 1944, Sherman units advancing through bocage country often met hidden Panthers and Tigers at point-blank range. Reports from Allied tankers were grim. We hit them 3 times. Nothing. 1 shot back. We burned. For German tank crews, the Sherman was a symbol of inferiority. Mass-produced, thinly armored, its gun outdated. They mocked it openly, calling it Tommy Cooker, the Tommy Cooker, for how easily it burned. German commanders believed their armored superiority was permanent, that craftsmanship and quality would always defeat quantity. But what they failed to see was how rapidly the American industrial machine and its engineers could adapt. In Detroit, engineers and ordnance officers analyzed field reports with urgency. They knew the Sherman's 75mm gun had reached its limits. They needed a solution, fast. The first answer was the 76mm M1 gun, with higher velocity and improved ammunition. But even that wasn't enough against the Panther's front armor. Tests showed it could only penetrate at close range or from the flank. A new type of shell was required, one that didn't rely solely on velocity or mass, but on material science itself. That search led to tungsten carbide, one of the hardest substances known to man. American scientists discovered that a dense tungsten core, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum or steel shell, could focus kinetic energy into a smaller impact point. The result was the HVAP round, high-velocity armor-piercing, capable of reaching muzzle velocities exceeding 3,400 feet per second. This innovation was more than chemistry. It was a shift in thinking. Where Germany built heavier tanks to defeat stronger armor, America sought smarter ammunition to make existing tanks deadlier. Instead of redesigning the Sherman, the U.S. rearmed it from within. The first HVAP rounds rolled off assembly lines in mid-1944. They were expensive, rare, and prioritized for elite armored divisions. Each tungsten core came from precious reserves, and later even captured Axis stockpiles. But their impact was immediate. Field trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground demonstrated that the new rounds could punch through 140 millimeters of armor at 500 yards, enough to breach a Panther's front plate. Still, many frontline units in Normandy never saw them. Logistics delays and tungsten scarcity meant only a fraction of Shermans carried HVAP by D-Day. Early battles in France continued to cost lives. Tankers learned to fight smarter, flanking, coordinating with infantry, calling air support. Their courage filled the gap that technology hadn't yet closed. Yet deep inside the Ordnance Department, the revolution was already underway. Production ramped up. Tungsten shipments were diverted from machine tools to munitions. By autumn 1944, the first shipments of HVAP rounds reached the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions, pushing into Lorraine. And as the fog rolled across those French fields, the men inside the Shermans finally held a weapon that could stare down the fearsome Panther and win. The battlefield equation was about to change, but the cost of reaching that point, in men and machines, had already been staggering. The story of how the Allies reached parity in armor wasn't just about metal and chemistry. It was about belief that adaptability could outmatch arrogance. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, the balance of armored warfare in Europe had tilted heavily in Germany's favor. On paper, the Wehrmacht's Panthers and Tigers outclassed nearly every Allied tank in service. The Panther, designated Panzerkampfwagen V, had evolved directly from the harsh lessons of the Eastern Front. In 1941 and 1942, German forces had faced the Soviet T-34, a shockingly efficient medium tank with sloped armor and wide tracks. The Panther was Germany's answer, an armored predator built to kill tanks at range, mounting the powerful 75 mm 42 L-70 gun. It was faster and better protected than any Allied counterpart. When the Allies invaded France, Panther battalions formed the backbone of the German armored response. Their guns could destroy Shermans at 2,500 meters, while most American shells simply ricocheted off their armor. In the first weeks after D-Day, the results were devastating. American and British units advancing through the bocage. Those thick, high hedgerows that split Normandy's farmland often met German ambushes head-on. The confined terrain turned every encounter into a close-quarters brawl. The Panther's gun could penetrate a Sherman long before the American crew saw its source. U.S. tankers resorted to flanking or luring their opponents into traps, tactics that demanded nerve and teamwork. Reports flowed in from the front. We hit the Panther at least 3 times with no visible effect. Crews learned to aim for weak points, the side hull, the rear engine deck, or wait for aircraft to do the killing. For many, the experience was demoralizing. Meanwhile, German tank crews felt untouchable. Their reports to Berlin spoke of complete destruction of inferior Allied machines. They took pride in single Panthers halting entire Allied columns. The nickname Ronson Lighter, implying Shermans ignited easily, spread across the front. But beneath that bravado, cracks were forming. The Panther was a mechanical marvel and a maintenance nightmare. Its complex transmission and final drive assemblies were fragile, often failing after just a few hundred kilometers. Its engine overheated easily, spare parts were scarce, and though its gun was unmatched, its optics required precision manufacture Germany could no longer sustain under Allied bombing. In contrast, the Sherman's true strength was reliability. American factories could produce them faster than any nation could destroy them. For every Panther that rolled off a German line, 6 Shermans left American docks. Each one might not match the enemy tank one-on-one, but together they formed an unstoppable tide. Still, the U.S. Army needed more than numbers. It needed confidence. Tank crews knew they were outgunned, and morale mattered as much as firepower. Ordnance engineers and field commanders pressed for immediate upgrades. Better guns, better shells, better coordination with air power. The key breakthrough came from a different kind of battlefield. The laboratory. Scientists at Watertown Arsenal and Aberdeen Proving Ground experimented with advanced penetrator materials. They learned that hardness and density, not just velocity, determined how well a projectile could punch through armor. Tungsten carbide, once used for machine tool bits, offered both. It was scarce, but devastatingly effective. When encased within a lightweight alloy shell and fired from a high-velocity gun, it could reach speeds exceeding 3,500 feet per second. The result was the HVAP round, high-velocity armor-piercing, officially designated M93 for the 76mm gun. Unlike conventional solid steel shells, the HVAP's tungsten core stayed intact on impact, concentrating its kinetic energy into a needlepoint strike. Tests proved that it could penetrate a Panther's glacis at ranges where standard ammunition failed entirely. The challenge was getting enough tungsten. Much of the world's supply came from China and Portugal, and wartime logistics limited import capacity. The Allies even reclaimed tungsten from worn-out machine tools to feed the new ammunition lines. Production was prioritized for the frontline divisions that needed it most, those fighting in France and Belgium. By late summer 1944, the first crates of HVAP ammunition arrived at forward depots. Tank crews, skeptical at first, were astonished during gunnery trials. The new shells sliced through armor targets that had been impervious for months. Veterans described it simply: the shot went through like butter. But the change came quietly. No new tank silhouette marked its arrival. No fresh headline or photograph. The Sherman remained the same outwardly humble machine. Yet inside its ammunition racks lay a new kind of weapon, one that would soon make German arrogance look foolish. For the first time since the landings in Normandy, American tankers could meet the Panther head-on, and not flinch. And as autumn settled over Europe, that realization would set the stage for a series of duels that turned disbelief into dread across the German Panzer Corps. For the men who fought inside the Sherman, the war was measured not in victories or defeats, but in seconds, the time between spotting a muzzle flash and the moment a shell struck home. The interior of an M4 was tight, almost claustrophobic. The crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, worked shoulder to shoulder in a rhythm that bordered on instinct. Every sound mattered. The whine of gears, the thud of a shell sliding into the breach, the shouted range call over the engine's roar. Against Panthers and Tigers, they knew the odds were rarely even. Many tankers described the first sight of a Panther's long 75mm gun as like staring down a railroad track. The Germans could kill from over a kilometer away. The Shermans often had to close within a few hundred meters to return fire. Courage became routine. Crews learned to fight with cunning, to flank, deceive, and strike from the edges of cover. They called their tank Ronson, yes, but they also called it the Old Girl, because it would start, move, and fire when they needed it most. Reliability was its armor of another kind. Letters home spoke of fear disguised as humor. One gunner wrote, "We're betting who spots the flash first, them or us. Loser buys the beer if he's still got a head." Beneath the dark jokes was a quiet defiance. The Sherman may not have been the most powerful tank on the battlefield, but its crews never accepted defeat as inevitable. Then came the new ammunition. When the first HVAP rounds appeared, they didn't look like salvation. Shorter, lighter, almost unimpressive. But when fired, the difference was instant. Crews felt the sharper recoil, heard the cleaner crack of velocity. "That one hits harder," one loader muttered during trials. He was right. For the first time, the Americans had a round that could turn fear into confidence. The psychological shift was subtle, but seismic. No longer were they purely the hunted. When a Sherman fired HVAP, it wasn't a desperate gesture. It was an equalizer. The HVAP round was the product of science under siege. In 1943, U.S. ordnance researchers realized that simply designing larger guns wasn't feasible in the short term. Tank turrets had limits. Logistics had limits. Instead, they looked to physics. The challenge was simple to state and brutal to solve: how to make a smaller gun perform like a bigger one. Their answer was found in density, not size. A standard steel shell lost much of its energy on impact, deforming or shattering, but a tungsten core, small yet immensely dense, could retain its energy even after punching through armor. The shell's lighter casing allowed higher velocity, while the tungsten tip focused that energy into a piercing point. At Watertown Arsenal, metallurgists tested hundreds of combinations, different heat treatments, casing alloys, and impact angles. They studied German-captured rounds too, noting the efficiency of their Pasker 40 tungsten ammunition. The Americans improved upon it with better heat resistance and higher muzzle velocity. When test shots began striking clean holes through Panther armor plates at 1,000 yards, the lab went silent, not from surprise, but from realization. They had just changed the equation of armored warfare. But tungsten was rare. Every pound used in ammunition was one less for machine tools and aircraft engines. The U.S. War Production Board had to ration it carefully. The HVAP rounds became the ammunition equivalent of gold. Early production was limited to a few thousand per month. Each shipment to the front was logged, guarded, and rationed. Tank commanders often received just a few rounds per vehicle. 5, sometimes 10, to be used only against the heaviest targets. crews painted small crosses on their ammo racks to mark them, the Panther killers. By the fall of 1944, as more divisions received their first allotments, reports began filtering back. Verified kills on Panthers, Tigers, even Elephant tank destroyers. Engineers adjusted designs, improving ballistic caps and manufacturing tolerances. The next generation of American ammunition had arrived. Behind every tank duel was a command decision, one forged far from the battlefield. When the U.S. entered the war, its armored doctrine was built around mobility, not dueling. Tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs, not fight other tanks head-on. Anti-tank guns and aircraft were supposed to handle enemy armor. But Europe's terrain and Germany's evolving strategy forced a rethinking. Tank-on-tank battles were no longer avoidable. The leadership's initial insistence on mass production over specialization was costing lives. General Jacob Devers and Ordnance Chief Clarence Cate championed faster upgrades. They clashed with logistics officers who warned that redesigning the Sherman mid-war would disrupt supply lines. Their compromise was elegant: improve ammunition first. It was quicker, cheaper, and logistically invisible. In factories, Henry Kaiser's industrial model, mass output at scale, met the scientific innovation of tungsten ammunition. It was the same philosophy that had birthed the Liberty ships. Quantity made powerful by adaptation. Commanders in the field, like General Patton, quickly recognized the impact. Patton himself was no sentimentalist about machinery, but he understood the morale effect of better weapons. In an October 1944 briefing, he noted, "If my boys believe that shell can kill a Panther, then by God, it can." The Army's leadership realized something deeper. Warfare wasn't static. It was an evolving conversation between innovation and arrogance. Germany built the perfect tank, but couldn't build enough. America built the imperfect one, but made it smarter. By the end of 1944, the American doctrine of mobility first had quietly shifted toward a more balanced philosophy, one where firepower, speed, and adaptability coexisted. The HVAP round was its symbol: small, fast, intelligent. From the laboratory to the battlefield, every bolt and round told the same story. That adaptability, not perfection, wins wars. And while German tank crews laughed at the Sherman's thin armor and low silhouette, they were about to discover how quickly laughter could turn into terror once that same silhouette began firing HVAP shells. To the German tank crews of 1944, the battlefield was familiar territory. They had been the hunters since the war began. Their Panthers and Tigers, the apex predators of Europe. They carried themselves with the confidence of men who knew their machines were unmatched. In the barracks and command tents, Allied tanks were a joke. Flying coffins, steel coffee pots, burning Shermans. Reports from Normandy reinforced that belief. German gunners boasted of hitting 4, 5, even 6 Shermans before being forced to relocate. But in late 1944, something began to unsettle that certainty. The first hints came from the field reports of Panzer Lehr Division and 2nd Panzer Regiment. Commanders wrote of Panthers being knocked out from the front, penetrations that should have been impossible according to their manuals. At first, they blamed luck or terrain or sabotage, but the pattern grew. At Lorraine and Hürtgen, crews reported unidentified ammunition, capable of piercing armor that had once seemed invincible. Tank commanders radioed for confirmation. Were we flanked? The answer came back, no. The hits were frontal. Inside the German ordnance offices, engineers pored over wrecks. They found neat holes bored straight through armor plates, the edges fused and scorched. Some believed it was new British APDS, armor-piercing, discarding sabot, ammunition. Others suspected the Americans had stolen German tungsten designs. Whatever the cause, the psychological effect was immediate. The laughter stopped. Crews began adding extra armor plates, welding spare track links across the front hull. Officers warned against overconfidence. A German tank ace later recalled, "We started to fear the small ones, the Shermans that kept coming." The shift wasn't only mechanical, it was cultural. The illusion of German invulnerability, so carefully built since 1940, was cracking under the pressure of Allied adaptation. Before HVAP rounds, Sherman crews had relied on maneuver and numbers. The doctrine was simple: 3 Shermans for every 1 Panther. 2 would distract, 1 would flank. Success depended on timing, courage, and often luck, but tungsten changed that rhythm. Now, a Sherman armed with HVAP didn't have to gamble everything on a side shot. At medium range, the round's velocity made even the thickest German armor vulnerable. Crews began to adjust tactics accordingly. Instead of scattering and surrounding, they began holding positions, letting the Panthers come into range. The key was patience. A single HVAP shell, well placed, could do what a dozen standard rounds could not. Field manuals were rewritten on the fly. Gunners learned to judge range by the color of muzzle flash. Loaders memorized HVAP markings to grab them first under stress. And commanders developed new firing drills that emphasized precision over volume. One American tanker in the 4th Armored Division described the first successful engagement. "We waited until he turned his gun. I called range at 700. The loader shoved in an HVAP. When we fired, it went straight through the cross. No fire, just silence. We couldn't believe it." The tactical shift also altered morale. Once, the sight of a Panther on the ridge froze entire platoons. Now, tankers muttered calmly over radios, "We've got the tungsten! Take the shot!" German tactics, meanwhile, grew desperate. They had to protect their flanks and their confidence. Panthers began operating in smaller defensive groups, often avoiding open ground where Allied gunners could get a clear line of fire. The hunted had become cautious. By winter, entire American battalions had redefined their engagement doctrine. The HVAP round turned the Sherman from a support vehicle into a duelist. Not because it made it invincible, but because it made it relevant. Wars are fought not only with steel, but with belief. And belief, once shaken, is hard to rebuild. For the German tank crews, pride had been both armor and weakness. They believed victory was their birthright, guaranteed by design and experience. For years, it was true, until it wasn't. When their shells failed to stop waves of Shermans, and when those same Shermans began firing back with impossible accuracy, doubt crept in. That doubt was deadly. In warfare, morale multiplies power. German reports began noting slower reaction times, less aggressive advances, more defensive posturing. Crews started abandoning tanks that could have been repaired. The psychological tide was turning. For the Americans, it was the opposite. Each successful hit, each Panther burning where once it would have triumphed, became a symbol. Confidence spread faster than news. The fear that had once haunted Sherman crews, that every duel was suicide, began to fade. Letters changed tone. "We can hit them now," one gunner wrote home from Belgium. We finally make them smoke. Behind that confidence was something deeper, the belief that adaptability was strength. American soldiers learned to see their machinery not as fixed, but as evolving. Imperfect, yes, but improving. In the factories back home, workers heard stories of their success. Posters went up in Detroit and Cleveland. Our tungsten saves lives. Women in foundries cheered when production quotas were beaten. The home front began to feel connected to the battlefield in a tangible, moral way. This was not propaganda. It was momentum, the sense that innovation could redeem vulnerability. For Germany, the same innovation that had once made them invincible was now their prison. They could not adapt fast enough. Their factories were bombed, their resources starved, their engineers scattered. The Panther, once their proudest creation, was becoming a relic, powerful, but outnumbered and outthought. The war was no longer a contest of firepower. It was a contest of endurance and imagination. And in that contest, the HVAP shell became a symbol, a small, dense reminder that sometimes the simplest innovations strike hardest. By the end of 1944, the stage was set. The Allies had the numbers, the factories, and now the weapon to make every Sherman count. Germany still had its Panthers and its pride. But pride could not stop. Tungsten. What followed next would be the proving ground. The duels that defined whether the Sherman's newfound strength was real or just another illusion of war. The autumn of 1944 brought Europe to a grinding, thunderous stalemate. The Allies had broken out of Normandy and were now pressing toward the German border, but every mile came at a cost. Rain turned fields to mud, forests to traps. Villages became fortresses. And across the shattered roads of France and Belgium, the Panthers still ruled the battlefield. Or so it seemed. The Lorraine campaign would change that. In September, General Patton's Third Army pushed eastward toward Metz, where remnants of the German 11th Panzer Division waited in ambush. The landscape favored the defenders, rolling hills, fog, and thick hedgerows that turned every bend into danger. The Panthers took up positions overlooking open ground, their long barrels glinting in the gray morning light. The first American tanks to advance were from the 37th Tank Battalion, mostly M4A1 Shermans, armed with the newer 76mm guns. Among them were a handful loaded with experimental HVAP rounds, recently delivered in unmarked crates marked simply, "For immediate combat evaluation." The order came just after dawn. Advance. Through the mist, the lead Sherman commander spotted movement, the faint silhouette of a Panther turret rotating on a ridge 900 yards away. Standard procedure dictated flanking, but the road offered no cover. He made a decision that would have been suicidal weeks before. Loader. HVAP. The new round slid into the breech with a metallic click. The gunner adjusted elevation, breath steady despite the heartbeat in his ears. On target. The Sherman fired. Instead of the usual dull crack, the sound was sharper, angrier. The round streaked across the distance and struck the Panther dead center in its glacis. A flash, a plume of smoke, and then silence. When the haze cleared, the Panther's gun sagged downward, motionless. The crew could hardly believe it. The shell had gone clean through. The impossible had just happened. Over the radio came the disbelieving voice of another tanker. "Did you see that? Straight through!" Word spread through the battalion like wildfire. Crews who had once dreaded every encounter with German armor now wanted more. The psychological reversal was instant. The hunters had become the hunted. By midday, 4 Panthers lay burning in the fields outside Arracourt. American tanks, firing from hull-down positions, had knocked out German armor at ranges previously thought futile. The key wasn't brute force. It was precision, confidence, and the speed of coordination. In the German lines, confusion reigned. Commanders radioed higher headquarters, reporting penetrations that defied expectations. "New ammunition suspected," one report read. Another simply stated, "Front armor compromised." The Panther's invincibility, its legend, had been shattered by physics. Patton, ever the showman, toured the wrecks days later. His staff recorded his words quietly. "Gentlemen, I believe we've just evened the odds." The Lorraine engagements proved more than just a technological victory. They were a psychological one. The U.S. Army had proven it could adapt faster than the Reich could react. From that moment, the Panther ceased to be a symbol of terror. It became a challenge to be met and beaten. But the real test came weeks later, under the gray skies of Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944. The German army launched a massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied front and force a negotiated peace. Thousands of tanks, including elite Panther and Tiger II battalions, spearheaded the assault. The American lines bent but did not break, and among the defenders, the Shermans, now armed in larger numbers with HVAP, held their ground. At the crossroads town of Bastogne, 10th Armored Division crews dug into defensive positions as snow began to fall. They faced Panthers advancing through the fog, engines growling like beasts in the cold. A young lieutenant named Charles Boggess, commanding a Sherman named Cobra King, watched through his periscope as one Panther crested a hill 800 yards away. The tank's broad, sloped armor gleamed faintly in the winter light. "Loader! HVAP!" The gun fired. The tungsten round screamed across the white expanse, hitting the Panther just below its turret. A flash erupted, internal ammunition igniting, and the German tank vanished in a burst of smoke and fire. The victory was more than tactical. It was symbolic. For 3 years, German tank crews had defined the rules of armored warfare. But now, on that frozen Belgian plain, an American crew had rewritten them. The effect rippled across the front. HVAP-armed Shermans began appearing in reports from every sector, knocking out tanks at range, halting counterattacks, reclaiming ground that had seemed lost. The German command, already strained by shortages, could not comprehend the scale of American adaptation. They still believed their armor superior, but superiority meant little when your tanks burned before they could fire twice. By the end of December, the Wehrmacht's last great gamble in the West had failed. The Panther, once feared, now lay abandoned in ditches and frozen fields. Each wreck was a monument, not to Germany's engineering genius, but to its fatal arrogance. The HVAP shell had not only pierced armor, it had pierced illusion. The turning point had come quietly. Not with the thunder of thousands, but with a single shot that finally leveled the battlefield. From that moment onward, the Allies no longer fought in the shadow of the Panther. They fought beside it as equals, and soon as victors. The new year of 1945 dawned cold and gray over Western Europe. Snow drifted through the shattered towns of the Siegfried Line, where concrete bunkers and steel dragons' teeth stretched for miles. The German army was retreating, but slowly, stubbornly, clinging to every hill and village. And still, the Panther prowled. By now, the Americans no longer viewed it with fear. They viewed it as a target. The 3rd Armored Division, advancing toward Cologne, had received a steady supply of HVAP ammunition from depots in Liège. Their tanks moved with renewed confidence, gunners calm behind the sights, loaders ready with tungsten-tipped rounds. The duels were now fought on equal terms. At a crossroads outside Stolberg, a Panther lay concealed behind a stone wall, waiting for a convoy of Shermans to appear. When it fired, its first shell ripped through the lead tank. Smoke and fire filled the air. The column halted, but before the Panther could fire again, a Sherman at the rear swung its gun, elevation adjusted, and fired a single HVAP shell at nearly 1,000 meters. The tungsten-cored punched through the Germans' frontal armor, igniting ammunition inside. The Panther exploded, turret blown skyward in a plume of smoke and flame. The crew in the Sherman erupted in disbelief. Their radios carried the message, "Panther down, 1 shot." Moments like these multiplied across the front. Reports of Panther kills increased dramatically, not because American armor had suddenly become invincible, but because every HVAP shell made a difference. Each encounter began to reveal the deeper truth. Technology alone could no longer save the German war machine. The Allies had mastered the industrial rhythm of innovation. In March 1945, the Ruhr Pocket became the final crucible. The industrial heart of Germany was surrounded by Allied forces on all sides. For decades, it had produced the steel and machinery that powered the Reich. Now, it would become its graveyard. German tank crews were running on fumes. Literally, fuel shortages forced them to abandon tanks before battle. Many Panthers were hidden in barns or camouflaged behind rubble, waiting for a last stand that would never come. When the Americans advanced, they met scattered resistance, isolated tanks firing from alleys, desperate but doomed. The Shermans, often outnumbering their enemies 5-1, advanced methodically, calling in artillery and air support when needed. But there were still duels. Brief, violent encounters that defined the end of the tank war in Europe. At Remagen, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, a Panther positioned on a ridge opened fire on the bridge. Its rounds fell short. A Sherman Firefly and 2 76mm Shermans returned fire. One of them loaded with HVAP. The tungsten round hit first, striking the German tank's lower plate. The Panther burst into flames, its engine compartment burning like a furnace. Nearby infantry cheered. One soldier later wrote, "For once, our tanks didn't run from theirs. They made them run from us." Across the front, German reports grew desperate. "Panzer losses unsustainable," one message read. "Enemy firepower exceeds armor tolerance." By April, German tank commanders had no illusions left. Many ordered their men to abandon vehicles rather than fight hopelessly. Some Panther crews destroyed their own tanks to prevent capture. A symbolic admission that the era of German armored dominance was over. For American troops advancing into the heart of the Reich, the wreckage told the story. Fields littered with burned-out Panthers, their engines silent, their crews gone. Sherman units moved past them, the smell of smoke and victory hanging in the air. War correspondents photographed the scenes. Sleek German tanks toppled beside the blunt, boxy silhouettes of Shermans. The contrast was poetic. Beauty defeated by function, arrogance crushed by adaptability. At an ordnance depot outside Cologne, American engineers examined captured Panthers riddled with neat entry holes from HVAP shells. They measured angles, traced penetrations, and smiled quietly. The data confirmed what every tanker already knew. Tungsten had rewritten the rules of survival. One engineer remarked, "They built perfection. We built progress." In the final weeks of the war, the last duels were almost ritualistic. Two dying titans fighting for relevance. But the outcome was already decided. At Dessau, a Panther ambushed an American column, destroying two Shermans. The third, its last HVAP round loaded, returned fire from 200 yards. The shells struck, penetrated, and silenced the Panther instantly. It was the last recorded Panther kill by HVAP ammunition in the European theater. Days later, Hitler was dead, Berlin encircled, and the war effectively over. The Panther, once the fear of Europe, now lay in ruins, its legend undone by the very innovation it had inspired. For the men who fought those battles, the memory lingered long after the smoke cleared. Tank crews who had once prayed for survival now spoke with quiet pride. They had faced the best Germany could build, and won not through luck, but through learning. The HVAP shell had done more than penetrate steel. It had pierced the heart of an empire built on arrogance, and in that moment, in the silence after the last Panther burned, the myth of German superiority gave way to a new truth. That progress, not perfection, decides the fate of wars. When the guns fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the smoking wrecks of Panthers and Tigers dotted the countryside, steel tombstones marking the end of an era. The once mighty Panzerwaffe, which had terrorized Europe from Poland to the Ardennes, now lay in ruins. The aftermath of the HVAP revolution went far beyond a single weapon. It reshaped how nations thought about armor, production, and technological adaptation. In the ruins of German factories, Allied engineers sifted through blueprints and half-finished prototypes. The E-series, the Maus, and experimental long-barrel cannons. They were feats of engineering brilliance, but also monuments to futility. Every design was exquisite, but slow to produce, impossible to maintain, and blind to the realities of industrial warfare. The Americans, by contrast, left Europe with a new doctrine: adaptability over perfection. The Sherman had proven that a good-enough machine, when multiplied, maintained, and upgraded in time, could beat an enemy obsessed with technical superiority. In post-war reports, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department highlighted this transformation. It wasn't just the HVAP shell that changed warfare. It was the mindset behind it. The ability to turn scientific discovery into field advantage. Fast. The realization that wars were not won by brilliance in the lab alone, but by integration, science, logistics, and soldier working in harmony. Germany had the finest tank on paper. America had the system that could evolve mid-war. And that system, flexible, responsive, and relentless, would define every conflict that followed. After the war, tungsten shortages and industrial exhaustion left Germany's research programs crippled. The Allies, in contrast, now controlled global tungsten trade. American and British scientists shared their wartime data, refining HVAP into the foundation of post-war kinetic ammunition. The lessons of 1944 and 1945 directly led to the armor-piercing discarding, sabot, APDS, and APCR developments that would dominate tank warfare in the Cold War. The principle, was the same: dense cores, higher velocities, precision over bulk. In Detroit, the new M26 Pershing tank entered production, larger, better armored, and already equipped to fire next-generation ammunition. It was a direct descendant of the Sherman's evolution and the ordnance breakthroughs, born in battle. The transition from desperation to dominance had taken just 18 months, an industrial metamorphosis unprecedented in history. For the tank crews who survived, the end of the war brought reflection more than celebration. Many had entered battle convinced their machines were death traps, and left it having witnessed those same weak tanks destroy the best armor Germany could build. In veterans' reunions years later, Sherman crews would still recall the first time they fired HVAP. They described it not as revenge, but as redemption, proof that their courage had finally been matched by capability. German veterans, too, spoke of the shock, the disbelief of seeing their armor fail, their confidence shattered. Some expressed admiration for the speed of Allied innovation. One recalled, "They learned faster than we believed possible. Our arrogance blinded us." It was a fitting epitaph for a war where technology and ego collided, and only one adapted. The fields of Lorraine and the forests of the Ardennes had become proving grounds, not just for tanks, but for ideas. In the end, the HVAP shell did more than pierce armor. It pierced history's illusion that, victory belonged to those with the most perfect machine. It showed that survival belongs to those who learn the fastest. The end of the war did not end the influence of the Sherman or its tungsten-tipped savior. In fact, the HVAP round and the lessons behind it became the foundation of the next 50 years of armored warfare. When U.S. and British analysts met in occupied Germany in late 1945, their conclusions were identical. The future of war belonged not to the biggest tank, but to the most adaptable system. They had learned, through fire and loss, that the side which could innovate faster, not necessarily design better, would always win. This realization shaped everything that followed. The HVAP experiment became the stepping stone for a new generation of ammunition. Engineers refined its concept into the armor-piercing discarding sabot, APDS, round. A slender dart fired at blistering velocity, its outer casing discarded mid-flight to reduce drag. It was the child of tungsten and speed, and by the 1950s, it would arm tanks like the British Centurion and American M48 Patton. What began as desperation in 1944 had become doctrine by 1949. Velocity, density, and precision over brute caliber. Meanwhile, tank design itself evolved under the same logic. The M26 Pershing gave birth to the M46, M47, and eventually the M60. Each generation not designed from scratch, but upgraded, tested, and iterated just as the Sherman had been. In this, America had unknowingly pioneered modular warfare. The Germans had aimed for perfection. The Americans perfected improvement. Captured Panthers and Tigers were dissected in Aberdeen and Bovington, their strengths catalogued and their weaknesses noted. Allied engineers admired their optics and guns, but also their over-engineering, their need for precision components that war could no longer supply. A tank that cannot be built in time, one U.S. report stated, is already a destroyed tank. And so, in the decades to come, Western armor would follow a philosophy born from that truth. Tanks built not for prestige, but for production, maintenance, and adaptation. The echoes of the Sherman and its HVAP shells can be traced directly to the M1 Abrams philosophy decades later. Reliability and technology fused by speed of response. The HVAP story also changed how armies viewed science. Before the war, research and combat were distant worlds. Laboratories on one end, soldiers on the other. The success of tungsten ammunition erased that divide. It proved that discovery was useless without rapid application, and that frontline reports could be as valuable as any laboratory test. This fusion of field and science became the cornerstone of NATO's post-war doctrine. The United States established the Ordnance Research and Development Division, dedicated to ensuring that battlefield experience directly informed weapons design. The model would spread globally, from Britain's Royal Armament Research to Japan's post-war industrial re-engineering, where former shipbuilders studied Allied modular production. In a subtle irony, Japan's own post-war tank development would draw from the same principles the Allies had used to defeat it: mass production, rapid iteration, and resource efficiency. The war had shown that adaptation was not just a military advantage, it was a national survival trait. The deeper legacy of the Sherman and its tungsten core was not one of technology, but humility. Germany had entered the war believing that precision and superiority would guarantee victory, but perfection became its own cage. Every tank an engineering masterpiece, and every masterpiece too slow to matter. America's lesson, learned painfully through loss and improvisation, was that strength lies not in flawlessness, but in flexibility. The HVAP round symbolized that shift. It was small, unassuming, almost plain. Yet it turned the tide of armored warfare because it existed at the intersection of science and necessity. It was not beauty that saved the Sherman, but function, not pride, but persistence. In that sense, the story of the HVAP round mirrored the broader story of World War II itself, a conflict where democracies, chaotic and improvised, learned faster than the autocracies that mocked them. What the Panther crews never understood, until it was too late, was that America's true weapon was not its steel, but its will to adapt. By the time the Cold War began, those lessons had hardened into policy. The Allies' triumph in industry and innovation became a deterrent as powerful as any bomb. Every tank built after 1945 carried within it the legacy of the Sherman and the echo of that tungsten round that had once turned arrogance into ashes. War remembers its victors in medals and monuments, but history, quietly, remembers something deeper: why they won. The story of the Sherman and its tungsten heart is not a tale of heroism alone. It is the story of a nation that learned to evolve faster than its enemy could adapt. It is the story of how flexibility defeated perfection. In the beginning, the Germans built tanks like cathedrals, intricate, elegant, and few. Each Panther was a masterpiece of steel and geometry. Yet, in their pursuit of flawlessness, they forgot the truth that war is not a museum. It is a factory. Across the ocean, America built with noise, smoke, and imperfection. The Sherman was not graceful. It was practical. It was flawed. Until it wasn't. When HVAP shells began cutting through German armor, they carried more than tungsten and velocity. They carried a philosophy born of necessity. Every shipyard, every lab, every mechanic who refused to accept good enough forged that philosophy. They proved that victory belongs not to those who start perfect, but to those who improve without pause. And so, the Sherman's true power was never its armor or its gun. It was its evolution. Each adaptation, thicker plates, faster engines, sharper ammunition, turned ridicule into respect, and respect into triumph. The German crews who once laughed at the weak American tank would live long enough to see their own machines rusting in surrender, while the Sherman rolled on, rebuilt, rearmed, reborn into the Cold War. Its legacy endured not in parades, but in principles. Every modern weapon, every innovation that turns simplicity into supremacy, carries its DNA. The Liberty ships that defied mockery, the bombers that crossed oceans, the tanks that learned mid-battle, all told the same story. When free people adapt, no empire can stand forever. In the end, the HVAP shell did not just pierce armor, it pierced arrogance. It proved that intelligence, speed, and courage combined could reshape even the hardest steel. And as the smoke of Europe cleared, one truth remained welded into history. Perfection breaks. Adaptation endures.